As the UFC has gained more mainstream popularity, some of its top athletes have become international superstars. Sold-out arenas in Vegas and across the world, fight night on ESPN, millions of dollars pouring in from pay-per-view, and million-dollar gates have contributed to the rise of the UFC. What was once a fledgling company struggling to find its footing as a legitimate operation has turned into a multi-billion-dollar organization hosting live events throughout the world and developing little-known fighters into international multi-millionaire superstars. In the late 1990s, as the UFC was struggling to find venues for their events, John McCain labeling the sport as human cockfighting, and the organization struggling to make money, boxing manager Dana White presented an opportunity to Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta to purchase the UFC. In January 2001, the Fertitta brothers purchased the UFC for $2 million. In this CNN article written in 2006, by 2004, the Fertitta brothers were $34 million deep into the UFC and had little to show for it. The Fertitta brothers decided to produce their own reality show where fighters would live in the same house and compete for a chance to earn a contract to fight for the UFC. They labeled it The Ultimate Fighter. Since network television companies didn't want anything to do with the sport, the Fertittas turned to Spike as their last resort. They decided to spend $10 million producing the show and allowing Spike to air the show with no cost of their own, a potential win-win for both parties. The show became a smash hit and was a major contributing factor to the rise of the UFC's popularity from pay-per-view sideshow to being a major sport in the US. Since the showing of The Ultimate Fighter Season 1, the UFC has experienced a meteoric rise in popularity and financial gain. The Fertitta brothers and President Dana White cashed out in July 2016 when they sold their stake in Zuffa LLC, the UFC's parent company, to WME-IMG for $4 billion. I start this video with the backstory of the UFC because I think it's integral to understanding why the UFC athletes get paid the way they do and why people who start companies receive a larger share of the revenues than the general public deem appropriate. Like with any professional sport, if we only focus on the athletes at the top of the food chain, then we have an improper view of the financial realities of the majority. Yes, Conor McGregor has made tens of millions of dollars. Yes, there are main events where fighters will leave the arena after making $1 million in one fight. Fighters must be worth millions of dollars. Here are a couple things that are really important when analyzing the finances of UFC athletes. Number one, when a UFC athlete has reached the top and is able to command multiple six figures for a fight, he or she is typically only fighting once, maybe twice per year. When you see someone earn $400,000 for a single night of work, that is essentially their yearly salary if they only have one fight per year. Number two, unlike other professional sports, UFC fighters have gym fees, a coaching staff, a manager, sometimes medical expenses, traveling expenses, and an expensive dietary regimen given the demands of the sport. Number three, when Reebok became the official sponsor of the UFC, a large portion of a fighter's revenue was diminished as they were no longer allowed to have other sponsors on their outfits. Let's dive into these arguments as they will give us a good idea of what the finances for UFC athletes are really like. Jeff Fox with the Sports Daily has compiled a list of career earnings for every UFC fighter. A casual fan will look at the top 10 list and see athletes with career earnings of $6 million all the way up to $20 million and think every fighter is bringing in enough money to be rich. Keep in mind that this is career earnings, which can be an accumulation of 5 to 10 years of earnings. Any number I give you next might have been earned over multiple years. Jeff has 1,910 athletes listed in this chart. 53% of UFC athletes have earned less than $100,000 total in career earnings. 69% of UFC athletes have earned less than $200,000 total, 84% have earned less than $500,000, 91% have earned less than $1 million. Let's appreciate UFC fighters for a second. Mixed martial arts, which is the sport the UFC promotes, is a combination of boxing, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, judo, wrestling, Muay Thai, karate, and most importantly, the ability to get hit by an assassin. Have you seen a Nate Diaz fight? I'm not an expert in this sport, but that guy seems to have a concrete jaw. And have you seen a Francis Ngannou punch or an Anderson Silva kick? The UFC athletes are so good nowadays that many of these fighters are world-class level good in many disciplines that traditionally take years to master. Just making it to the UFC takes years of insane work ethic, becoming a professional at many disciplines, and learning to take a beating. On top of injuries, brutal sparring sessions, and the uncertainty of ever making a dollar, the athletes have to spend a lot of time and energy just to put themselves in position to make it. And these athletes have a process called cutting weight before the fight, which is a testament to their dedication realization when you see how hard of a process this is on one's body and mind. Let's start with the success stories of the UFC. The athletes who made $1 million to $5 million in their career are names that a casual fan like me even recognize. But remember, these guys are successful and had careers of at least 5 or more years, so their per year income is really closer to $200,000 to $1 million. Miles Jury provided us with an idea on how the finances work for fighters. Let's assume one of the top fighters earns $500,000 per fight as a main draw, and he or she fights once per year. He allocates 5 to 10% of his earnings for gym fees. That's $25,000 to $50,000 to their gym. Jury claims the industry standard management fee is 20% of the fighter's purse. For our fighter, we'll send 20%, which is $100,000 to management. Jury mentions other expenses such as medical fees to be licensed, as well as blood work, private coaching, and various expenses. Given our example fighter is a top draw, I assume he or she will be paying for additional coaching. In addition, our example fighter will be paying for constant massages, physical therapy, and high-end nutrition and supplementation. This could be in the thousands. Of course, this athlete will also have to pay taxes. For fights in states with no state income tax, our fighter will save some money, but federal taxes are going to be large since our fighter is in the highest tax bracket. 30% to taxes is probably accurate, which would be $150,000 on gross or roughly $100,000 on net, depending on how much the fighter can deduct. Before our fighter even receives money to spend, the $500,000 is down to about $250,000, which is a great income for most people. But that's only $20,000 per month for lifestyle expenses, and fighters only last so long at the top. Some of these fighters earn this kind of money for 2 to 3 years, and then it's basically over. I'm not going to spend much time on sponsorships, but the UFC made a huge change when they teamed up with Reebok as their official sponsor. Previously, the fighters had more sponsorships than Peyton Manning on their trunks and sweatshirts. After hearing the news, Brendan Schaub stated that he had made 6 figures in sponsorship in each of my last 6 fights. Sponsorship numbers are hard to find, but it's clear that this move by the UFC financially affected the fighters at the top. In this article, Ben Askren talks about how he only got paid $3,500 to wear Reebok for his first UFC fight. The sponsorship money follows a tiered system based on the number of fights the fighter has had under his or her belt in the UFC. The top tier is $30,000 for a title challenger and $40,000 for a champion. The athletes at the top certainly make endorsement money, but this video isn't necessarily aimed at the top champions. The goal of this series is for you to understand how easy it is for your favorite athletes to go broke, even though they may earn $500,000 for a single fight. Most UFC fighters don't fight for long. Outside of the household names, a majority of the fighters will only have a handful of fights that make them enough to consider fighting a full-time profession. Our example from earlier was a fighter making $500,000, and the net is maybe $20K to $30K per month for a couple years. Think about all the fighters who make $100K for their one fight during the year. It might only be $50,000 after all the expenses and taxes are taken out. Because these fighters don't fight for long, they only earn their show money for a couple of years, and then they're relegated to take on some smaller fights for Bellator or other leagues. We're talking about a profession that you can realistically only have 2 to 3 fights per year. Most fighters are barely earning enough to make this their full-time income. And even for the challengers who are making multiple 6 figures for one night of fighting, they may only earn that money for a couple years and then it's over. If none of the money was invested, then they need to find a new career immediately after fighting in the UFC, the pinnacle of that sport. Think about the UFC athletes who make it to the top. They spent years training in a physically demanding sport, they learned skills that require years of patience and dedication, and they risked physical harm to earn good money. When athletes finally do reach the top, they spend money. This is known. They buy cars, they buy houses in the nicest neighborhood in their city, they get married and have kids, they send their kids to private school, they have expensive health insurance. Athletes who make it to the top with huge social media followings, endorsement deals, million-dollar fights can easily spend $250,000 per year on their lifestyle. That is not hard to do. Think about this. A fighter who challenges to be the champ can have a very successful career and earn $2 million fighting. Luke Rockhold is the threshold for $2 million in career earnings. Number 77 out of 1,910 means he is in the top 4% of earners in UFC history. If we consider expenses, taxes, and some endorsement money, he'd be lucky to have $1 million remaining. Let's assume he spent nothing during his career on personal expenses and has $1 million saved in the bank. Here's the real reason why athletes go broke so quickly, and it will blow your mind. Athletes at the top can easily spend $100,000 per year on life expenses. Cars, mortgage, health insurance, wife and kids. $100,000 per year is pretty easy when you're a professional athlete. He's 36 years old. If he has $1 million in cash, then he will be out of money in 10 years at the age of 46. Tyron Woodley talks about blowing through his money here.
I blew through a lot of money, man, a lot. Jewelry and VIP and all these experiences, all those things that came with the championship life. So when you start making money, I bought like 7 cars and 2 houses and all these trips, and nobody ever lifted a hand when we was at a restaurant, 10, 15 people to eat dinner. And, I was going freaking to VIP clubs and all this like every other week. And I just imagined making that amount of money for a very long time. And they very quickly said, poof, damn, hold on. Like, you going to tell me March 3rd, like, this is different? Like, it's not the same?
Tyron is number 22 on the career earnings list, and he talks openly about blowing through his money. I hope you see how easy it is for these guys to spend it all. A guy spending $250,000 per year will run through $1 million in cash in 4 years. A fighter whose career ends at 35, who has $1 million saved, can be broke by 40. Now start thinking about the fighters who didn't earn millions and only earned $800,000 or less. What about all the fighters who get divorced and get to sign away most of their money to their wife's boyfriend? How about child support? How about the fighters who live nice lives like Tyron, spending it all and then their career ends and they have nothing? It's unfortunate, but this is the reality when these athletes earn a big paycheck and don't invest. If these fighters are fortunate enough to earn a good bit of money, then they need to invest as soon as possible to ensure they don't have to work after their fighting days. Back to the Fertitta brothers who bought the UFC for $2 million and sold it for $4 billion. They took insane risk and bought the UFC when it was nearly bankrupt. Lorenzo has been quoted as saying his lawyer was confused as to what exactly he purchased. Lorenzo's response was basically nothing but the brand name. There were no assets in the purchase. They spent tens of millions of dollars promoting this new sport while no one wanted any part of it. At one point, they went nearly bankrupt. They put $10 million into the Ultimate Fighter with no guarantee of success. When an organization finally succeeds, the founders who took all the risk are going to earn exponentially more than any employee or contractors. The UFC is no different, which is why the Fertitta brothers and Dana White are worth significantly more than any fighter without ever stepping in the ring. That's fair, right? The Fertitta brothers have family ties to the mafia. Their father, Frank Fertitta Jr., was the founder of Station Casinos, which if you've been out here in Las Vegas, you know how big of a business this is. The sons grew up wealthy, have access to connections that me and you don't have, access to money, and surprise, surprise, they're successful in the casino business too since they were given a casino empire. My buddy Kenny pointed something out to me though. Lorenzo Fertitta, the son, just happened to be a commissioner on the Nevada State Athletic Commission from 1996 to 2000. Not everyone is able to serve that position at 27 years old. Maybe having family ties in this city helped. But more importantly, UFC was not sanctioned to host events in Las Vegas, leading the company to near bankruptcy by 2001. Oh, and interestingly enough, this was the same time that Lorenzo and his brother Frank were able to purchase the UFC for $2 million, and then all of a sudden the UFC was able to host events in Las Vegas. Do you think Lorenzo being a commissioner on the NSAC factored into that? It's an interesting coincidence, isn't it? This isn't meant to take anything away from what these guys have accomplished, but the ability to sell the UFC for $4 billion relied on paying the fighters a little less than what I believe they should be earning. In other major sports, the revenue share of the athletes is roughly 50% and is always being negotiated. Reports of the revenue share for the fighters in the UFC is roughly 15 to 20%. In my eyes, the UFC has thrived by underpaying the fighters, and that is the biggest reason for the $4 billion price tag. There have been a lot of fighters in the UFC just making enough to pay their team and put food on the table, while the people getting rich were 2 brothers who were born wealthy, had access to millions at a young age so they could pump money in this sport, and had every advantage in the book. But that's the ugly side of business. If you don't have ownership, you're at the mercy of the owner's desires. I hope that the fighters who watch this start turning their earnings into business ownership outside of the ring so they don't have financial problems when their career ends. Thanks for watching.